What did Ricky Bobby say in Talladega Nights? I want to go fast? Well, he said it a bunch of times. That's the name of the game in motorsports, isn't it? Bill France Sr., the founder of NASCAR, who was reared on high bank circuits like board tracks, wanted speeds faster and more competitive, at least in his mind, like Talladega and Daytona. And while the land speed records on the Daytona beach sands approached 200 miles an hour, it took a while for the stock cars to do it. But that wasn't on a closed course. And although it was more of a publicity stunt than an official timed session, Buddy Baker was the first to do it at Talladega in the spring of 1970. In 1981, NASCAR shortened the wheelbases on race cars, and drivers said that they were hard to handle. However, that didn't seem to be the case in 1982, when Benny Parsons became the first driver ever to officially qualify at over 200 miles an hour at Talladega. And though the chase for 200 in the late 60s and into the 70s was on, Bobby Allison's crash at Daytona pretty much put an end to that. But anywho, and now that the mark was set at Talladega, surely the next one would come at Daytona the following season for Speed Weeks 1983. But who would be first? By 1983, with almost 80 Cup wins, 2 Daytona 500s at that time, and 3 titles to his credit, everyone knew South Carolina's Cale Yarborough and how fast he was at Daytona this season. But up until about 1980, very little was known about the competitor whose fellow drivers called the comedian Gallagher and his Sledge-O-Matic. But other than looks, he had very little to nothing in common with the famous comedian. He married Jean, and in 1974 graduated from Western Michigan University with an automotive engineering degree, and began Roland Brothers Heating and Cooling with his dad, George, and brothers in the Detroit suburb of Westland, Michigan. Like most Detroiters, Rick Roland took after his dad, George, and began racing at the local short track down in Flat Rock, south of Detroit. It was hard growing up in and around the Motor City with cars everywhere. And, like most young men, Rick Roland aspired to something bigger. His time at Flat Rock, although brief, led to bigger ideas like Michigan International Speedway, for one, and the bigger tracks like Talladega and Daytona. Taking a Howe chassis and a Camaro front snub, the team fashioned a 1977 Oldsmobile Cutlass 442 to run on ARCA's short tracks and super speedways, and in 1980 won the Most Improved Driver Award. With Andy Schwartz of Shelby Engineering helping to maintain the car and Dad George, the crew chief, Rick and the team faced 13s. They started 13th 4 times and finished 13th 3 times. We interviewed Rick for our magazine Supercars Today in 1994, and he laughed when he talked about seeing Salem for the first time. He said they took one look at the banking, and his dad George said, "You know, we can turn around and go home because I don't think anybody's seen us yet." Using heating and cooling principles, the boys kept looking at cars more aerodynamic and kept massaging and rounding corners and even reading sandblast marks underneath and around the car. The team finally settled on the Pontiac Ventura, thinking that car would be better shaped. However, a wreck at Flat Rock almost derailed that plan. Making only one start in the ARCA Series in 1981 at Daytona, where they finished 23rd, 1982 was looking to be a banner year with the Ventura, as the team showed up and qualified 4th at the World Center of Racing, and as Roland later said, they just couldn't figure out what a bunch of guys from Westland were doing to go so fast. In May, the number 55 went to Talladega and won the pole, but they dropped out due to engine failure. But by July, they put it all together, winning the pole and the race. With people like Davey Allison in the race, Bill Green became the dominant car, and Roland had broken a rocker arm earlier, so they were down on power. He said later, "I tried pulling out to pass 7 or 8 times and couldn't get by. I thought it'd be just like on TV, where you come out and go by. Well, I moved out and I about stopped. On the next to last lap, I backed up, then put it to the floor. I looked at him, he looked at me, and I said, it's like, I'm not going anywhere." With both now side by side, Green admitted later that he backed off, thinking the move wouldn't work being on the outside, so it appeared Roland blew right on by. Rick added, "I looked up in my mirror, and it's almost as if I couldn't see him. I thought, this is pretty cool." This is also the race that took the life of Gene Richards, and Rick admitted at the time, "I'm sorry to hear about him. He was a super guy." Now heading into 1983, you can tell who ARCA thought would be the car to beat on the speedways. Although I'm not sure whether Cale or Rick ever met personally, they did meet with a common goal, and that was to be the first to 200 miles an hour at Daytona. Most folks know that scrutiny is at its highest at the beginning of any season. And as Rick explained, we went out in practice and were turning laps at about 193 and going through tech later. They looked at other cars and came to mind. Bob Loga, who was president of ARCA at the time, pulls out his tape measure and says, "You can't do this, you can't do that." So we started arguing in public, and I said, "No, hold on," and asked Scott Schultz, who at the time was Flat Rock Speedway general manager, for a conference so we could talk like human beings, and we did. So both decided to compromise on a restrictor plate because, as Roland explained, Loga was receiving some pretty heavy pressure from NASCAR to quote-unquote slow them down. But there was only one problem for the underfunded team, and that was, as Rick explained, he heard that those plates can lean out a cylinder, and he said if that happened, they were going home. But according to Rick, he said Bob told him he wasn't going to try to slow him too much and just give him the measurements off the top of the manifold. So Rick told him 13 16ths. So Loga gave him a 1 inch and 3/4 inch plate. Then Roland added, "I've heard that if you raise the tower on the manifold, you get more airflow and can go faster." Unbeknownst to officials, the throttle openings were actually the size of the holes in the plate, to which Roland explains, "Racers are creative." After turning 6,800 RPMs in practice, Roland went out to qualify and shut the engine off as soon as he hit the stripe, since, as he explained, we taped up everything we owned and it started to run hot. He looked down and saw the tachometer reading 6,900 RPMs and said, "Boy, this lap is going to be horrible." But as he coasted around, the fans were cheering like crazy. On the cool-down lap, Rick explained, "Boy, these people in Florida sure are friendly." But as he rolled down pit road and the line of folks cheering and clapping his lap, he said it's funny how through all those people he could pick out Bob Loga. He said, "I'm sure he didn't know what to do, and I'm sure NASCAR let him have it." Officially, the Roland Rocket went 199.093 miles per hour. Cup qualifying followed ARCA qualifying, and they sent a crewman over to watch inspection over there, and they claimed they rushed Cale right through. That thinking being, you can't have an ARCA car outshining NASCAR qualifying, especially on the biggest stage in the world. But sure enough, Cale took care of that. Roland explained that he and other crew members went up and down pit road and checked with folks, and at least half a dozen claimed that he went over 200 miles an hour. So afterwards, Roland and Bob Revak, second fastest qualifier, are sitting in a little room, and they asked Bob, "How does it feel to wait all day to be second fastest?" And he said, "Well, qualifying trim is a lot different than race setup." And then they asked Rick what he thought of what Bob said, and he said, "Well, I'm glad I'm not the one sitting here trying to explain how 6 or 7 miles an hour faster isn't that big of a deal." So on race day, the number 55 lived up to its billing as the Rocket, and Rick took off, but this time with Jim Vaughn and Jack Bowser's potent Thunderbird right on his tail. Unfortunately, the same problems that reared its ugly head for the big block engine were now plaguing the Roland team, not even halfway through the Daytona ARCA 200. The Gallagher lookalike explained, "People knew that if we made it past halfway, we'd win the race, and they led 24 laps in this one, but they were pitting continually, trying to add oil to the oil tank, and they finished 19th, 9 laps down." There were 2 more chances for the Ventura to try and win another race, but unfortunately, after qualifying second each time at Talladega, both times resulted in a DNF. But they did finish third in their short track car at Mount Clemens later that year. Most of us know the legend of Cale Yarborough, going on to win the '83 Daytona 500 in a backup car, and then following that up in 1984 with another win, while Rick, who was forced to phase out the Ventura, brought an Oldsmobile Cutlass back in 1984 and was basically an also-ran. Perhaps Roland was his own worst enemy. Joking later, we'd write things like Goliath on the engine block, but really, the car was just aerodynamically superior. By 1988, he tried one more race at Daytona and was done with his racing career. Well, we shouldn't say done, as he took part in the Oldsmobile Aerotech experiment with A.J. Foyt as the main driver in the late 1980s for the Motor Trend experiment. By the 1990s, at the end of the interview with Supercars Today, Roland was heavily involved in running Roland Brothers Heating and Cooling in the Detroit suburb of Westland. But he did say, "What I'd like to do is get a car, bring it to the track, put it on the pole, and then load it up and go home and let them try to figure out what in the world are they doing and how in the world do they go so fast." Ironically, Roland moved to South Florida and began his own refrigerant reclamation business. As for the 200-mile-an-hour run, did it really happen? And here's the irony. They felt the ARCA car was illegal, but did anybody feel that the Cup car was? Roland explained later, "I was trying to get a car into one of the ARCA races, and Bob Logan and I were sitting there talking, and I told him, 'Bob, we really didn't have an illegal engine.' And he said, 'Oh, I know you did because of thus and such.' And I thought, why in the world would I be lying about it now?" Perhaps this will put the subject to bed. Roland explained, "A few years back, I had some cousins arguing about it down in North Carolina. So they finally decided to call down to Daytona and ask. The woman who answered the phone said, 'Yes, we have that here, but we think he was cheating.'" Following that run, you could see Rick and his car in a few ads here and there, and some publications, and some periodicals. But other than that, unless Roland decides to come back to the track, the yellow number 55 will live on in our memories, well, and here on Stock Car Facts.